project or a supposedly non-political project. However, maintaining the status quo through trilateral cooperation or a supposedly depoliticized South-South cooperation is as political as a counter-project. Now, having these two broad categories lead me on to also say that the Latin American experience, contemporary experience, also suggests that there might be mixed forms. We may hear a little bit more about that. I would raise the case of Brazil, where I can clearly see in the cooperation with Venezuela, for example, there's a clear struggle for a different world order, a structural transformation, while at the same time there's a form of best practice transfer. I would make a similar claim for Mexico, but I'm only raising the question here. So, there's a huge absence at this conference. I was just in the plenary session earlier on, and I heard someone speaking from El Salvador about the Ibero-American framework. There's regular summits. Now, it would be interesting to hear more about that, because in my opinion this is a pure form of Spanish corporate interest in Latin America, which uses this form of international cooperation that has very little to do with South-South cooperation as it is actually currently happening in Latin America. So I have a chart here. In 2014, these governments, 28 governments in Latin America and the Caribbean belonging to different regionalist projects, decided to create a complementary economic zone governed by the South-South cooperation principles of solidarity, complementation, and cooperation. This is as it was in the days of Bandung, and subsequently in the formation of the G77. And I highlighted a couple of countries in yellow, which have the most proactive, the most active South-South cooperation programs in Latin America and beyond Latin America and the Caribbean. We have Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, Venezuela, and of course Cuba. Cuba is one of the longest South-South cooperation partners worldwide, and I'm sure many here in the room are from nations that have benefited from Cuban internationalism. So, just to give you a brief figure here, Petrocaribe, which is part of the ALBA project, involving 19 member states, has only that initiative alone has, over the past 10 years, brought 432 development projects of a value of almost $4,000 million to the Caribbean and Central American member states. It's a huge amount of money. No one talks about that. We'll talk about education. Here's again my differentiation between a political project and a technicality. Best practice transfer, and here, based on my own work of the past 10 years in Latin America, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, in the ALBA space, education is reclaimed as a universal human right, public good, and state responsibility. Education for social mobilization and participation. The older members here remember literacy campaigns, maybe, that were highly politicized in the 1950s, 60s, 70s in the developing world, especially in Africa and Latin America. All levels and forms are promoted as equally important for the full development of the person. It's a collective approach and an integrated approach to development. Education is part of a multidimensional development project. So, that involves, of course, capacity building, and I'm grateful for one of the speakers yesterday who suggested that speaking on behalf of the Global South is also a capacity. And it's not just technical, instrumental skills acquisition. So if we look at the more technical understanding of education, I'm raising some questions because I hope we get answers here. Is education purely skills transfer? For human capital development, the reduction of development to economic growth, to development as understood as purely only economic development, individualistic gains rather than societal gains, what modalities are favored in this kind of cooperation, job-oriented capacities only. These are questions I raise in my juxtaposition of the two models. So here are just some brief figures of these tremendous successes in South-South education cooperation in Latin America and the Caribbean and beyond. We have in the field of literacy the Cuban Yo Si Puedo method, which has been globalized over the past 10 years, has in Latin America alone, within the ALBA member states, has benefited almost 4 million people have become literate. Post-literacy education included 1.174 million people, basic education that is. A number of countries have been declared illiteracy-free by UNESCO. Worldwide, the globalization of Yo Si Puedo, and we see a range of countries here outside Latin America and the Caribbean, in Africa, in Asia, and in the North, has liberated over 8 million people from illiteracy. That's basic literacy, we have to have that clear, but this is a scope that is unreached by any other development cooperation, I claim. And the method has been adopted to a minimum of 14 different socio-cultural contexts, languages, and so forth. There's a lot in my publications on this, if you want to look that up in detail. Higher education is equally impressive. Still within the context of the Cuban crisis after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Cuban government nonetheless continued its solidarity internationalism, opened up in the late 1990s the School of Medicine, the International School of Physical Education and Sports. The Salvador Allende Latin American School of Medicine was founded in Venezuela, also in the early 2000s. And we can see how far-reaching globally these projects are. The ALBA member states, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, have created a university network in which student exchanges take place. There's the effort of creating a regional curriculum for secondary education. There's recognition of qualifications, mutual recognition in that space. And we have a scholarship program, largely financed through Venezuela, that has benefited, or currently, or in 2013, the figure is from 4,000 students from 48 Latin American, Caribbean, African, Asian, Middle Eastern countries in 36 Venezuelan universities, many of which were founded under the Chavez government. There were around 35, meanwhile 40 universities created since Chavez entered office in 1999. And in December 2015, the Nicaraguan and Venezuelan government announced the creation of a Petro-Caribe Common University Space, which is another network of universities that includes the University of the West Indies, which so far has been excluded from these kind of processes and relations. Now, with this in mind, I would like to pass on now to our first speaker, Gerardo Bracho, from Mexico. Maybe read out briefly the information. As I said before, we're going through the different speakers now, and in the end, Jordi will sum up and make some comments, and then there's room for questions.
Thank you, Thomas. We begin with the first panelist, and we'd be happy to hear Gerardo Bracho's views. He is a senior advisor at Mexican Agency for International Development Cooperation and has worked as a Mexican diplomat since 1990. Welcome on board, and we'd be happy to hear your thoughts.
Well, I must confess I'm not an expert on this issue, but I'm happy to contribute as I can. Just reacting a bit to what you were saying. I think you're basically right. I mean, those experiences that have had more success have been driven by political movements. No, I mean, in the case of Latin America, is clearly Cuba has been much more successful than any of us. But just that putting apart, I will just, what I'll try to give now is a general view of why I think South-South cooperation is so important for this particular sector. I mean, we could argue that South-South cooperation is important for all sectors, but I have the feeling, I have the impression that it's particularly important for the case of education. So I will just start by 5 propositions. They are all quite self-evident. And then I will to develop my argument. The first, of course, is that education is crucial for development. It's not only, I mean, it is both, let's say, an ingredient of development, is part of development. You can have a richer education, I mean, everything equal, if you have a more educated population, you have a more developed education. So, education is part of development. It's not only a driver of development, but it's a driver also. So the more education you have, the wealthier your country becomes, and you have a virtuous circle between development and education. Of course, there's no linear relation between development and education. You can have, as we will see, you can have countries that have a per capita much lower per capita income, but higher level of development. So the first issue is just to be clear that education is absolutely basic for achieving development, and is part of development. The second proposition, also very self-evident, is that education outcomes, the educational outcomes can be very simple. In a way, if you take, for example, the PISA, the PISA surveys on capacities, you know, PISA, this program created by the OECD, where it compares the capacity of young people from 15 years old, and they put the same test to different kind of coming from very different countries. Sometimes you have even 60 countries participating in PISA, and you can see which children are good in mathematics, from which country they come, mathematics, science, etc. So the outcomes can be very simple. The outcomes in education, you just see, an outcome can be, can you read or can you not read? Can you count or you cannot count? But if the outcomes are very simple, in a way, the educational process is a very complicated matter. Amazingly complicated. There are so many variables that have that have an incidence on education. Out of the top of my head, I just made a list. It depends on the schools. If the schools have a good infrastructure, it depends on the teachers. If the teachers are good, if they have a good salary, if they have good incentives. It depends on the trade unions. If you have trade unions committed to education, or trade unions that are just committed to the economic interest of the teachers. Educational programs, how do you incorporate technology? Even the home and the family have, of course, a bear in education. I would say also the TV system. For example, I think that in Mexico we have such a terrible TV system that these companies really uneducate the Mexicans. So it's another factor, no? If you have a state or a private sector contribution, if you have the institutional arrangements you have for your educational systems, if they're decentralized or centralized, what I'm trying to say here is that there are so many variables in this particular sector, and it's much more complicated than, for example, producing coal. No? If you want to produce coal, you have inputs. You need if you want to produce steel, you need coal, you need good workers, etc. But if you want to produce an educated population, you have all these amazingly complicated variables, and then, of course, what you get out of this is that for example, let's say Vietnam comes number 17 in PISA, and is at a much higher level than countries that are much richer. For example, the US, UK, France, they're all behind Vietnam. And can you imagine the amount of resources that the average American children gets in relation to the amount of resources that the average Vietnamese children get for education? It's huge, the difference, and still you will have a better outcome in Vietnam than in the US. And in the case of Latin America, as you were already mentioning, I mean, Cuba is much ahead of the table. In current prices, the per capita of Cuba is more than 2 times less than Mexico. And if you see the levels of the Cubans in relation to Mexico and even to Chile and to Argentina, the education level of the Cuban children are much higher. My third point would be that with so many variables in place, it is difficult to know what to do. No, I mean, which combinations of all these variables are you going to put all your interest in infrastructure, or in the wages of the teachers, or how you're going to incorporate the parents in creating the programs for education? I mean, there are so many variables to take into account, and then what happens is that I will take, for example, the case of Mexico. Is that it's such a complex issue that preparing for this talk, I was reading a book on the history of Mexico's education. It happens then that from 1940, more or less, each government, we have a new government each 6 years, each government has come with a reform, with a change, which they always want to do something on education. Now again, our present government has launched a huge reform, educational reform, but it has coming for, we have had this history for the last 50 years. So what's the point here? The point is that all these changes, all these reforms are not costless. I mean, if you're changing the environment from one president to the other, then the whole system has to kind of adapt, and you create another kind of curricula, and then you have to adapt again. So it's a very costly process. So now I'm coming down my argument to the importance of South-South cooperation. Being so costly, being so costly, being so complicated, being so holistic, you really need, once before you launch a reform, before you launch any change, you really have to look at what has been achieved elsewhere. What has been achieved elsewhere? And here is where South-South cooperation comes in, because it will help you a lot if you have more or less an idea of what has been tried somewhere else. And of course here the South is much more relevant to the South than the North, than the experiences of the North. Why? Because again, all these holistic cultural matters that are involved in education. Just to put you an example, in the 1990s, the World Bank came with a great idea that because it had worked very well in the North, the South should also start to decentralize its own educational systems. And we did that in Mexico in the 90s. Brazil went the same way, Argentina and other countries. Well, in the case of Mexico, it was a bit of a disaster. Why? Because we don't have the local institutions to really deal with such a complex matter. So in the end, this decentralization that was proposed by the North to the South didn't work, at least in the case of Mexico very clearly. And now the part of the reform process that we're going through is a bit re-centralizing. And coming back to Cuba, well, of course, is a very, very centralized system. It has worked. And so the North doesn't have doesn't have much a clue of how to deal with education. Education has been one of the things that we really haven't succeeded. I mean, we didn't succeed in the MDGs. It's going to be complicated to succeed with the SDGs, with this idea of having a better quality. And that's where I think South-South has to come in. And just my final word here is that South-South, we have to look at it not only as looking at the best practices and showing this best practices to everybody, but it has to be broader than that. It has to be really a knowledge sharing. I mean, Mexico and other countries could also share all their misshapes, the reforms that didn't follow well, the reforms that had other types of outcomes. So you have to talk not only about successes, but also about failures. I leave it here.
Thank you very much, Gerardo. Gerardo, who is Senior Advisor to the Mexican Agency for International Development Cooperation. I think we will hear a little bit more in a minute, but first we will have Karin Costa Vasquez from the Brazilian Center for International Relations, where she is a researcher, and she's a member of the Latin American Council of Social Sciences, CLACSO, the Buenos Aires-based think tank. Karen has over 10 years of experience in strategy, design, policy advisory and management of international cooperation for development initiatives with the United Nations, the World Bank and regional development banks. And I think you are also integrated in the RIS here now. Good. Okay, take the floor. There's your PowerPoint. You won't need the microphone.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Gerardo, for the very insightful presentations. And in fact, I would like to speak a little bit about an experience that SEBRI has been conducting jointly with ISS in trying to understand a little bit of the experiences on South-South cooperation in education and skills development on the ground, and what lessons can we learn from these experiences for the implementation of the SDGs in education and skills development. This is still a work in progress, so another objective of this presentation is also to get your views and your inputs so that we have a knowledge exchange here. And shifting a little bit the focus from Latin America to Africa, Gerardo explained very well the importance of education and South-South cooperation in this sector specifically. In the context of Africa, this topic is particularly important for the regional development, and it's clearly stated, for instance, in the African Union's Agenda 2063, the Africa We Want articulated as the need to actively promote science, technology, research, and innovation to build human resources, capabilities, and skills for the African century. The topic is also highlighted in the Common African Position on the post-2015 development agenda and the consensus statement that was used for the intergovernmental process of the post-2015 development agenda. So this is just a highlight to showcase how the topic is being thought, but also with the private sector and the civil society showcases options for building capacities. And to what extent these modalities are also required for delivering structural impact projects and giving you more options to design programs and deliver these programs. So as I mentioned, this is still a work in progress. We're finalizing the case studies and to be published soon. And this is part of a broader effort to systematize practices in South-South cooperation. We think that case studies, they are not an end in themselves. They are an instrument to bring lessons and messages to other processes and for the implementation of the SDGs. So these are my points. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. We have next Juan Pablo Prado Layande. I slipped into French here, sorry. Who is Associate Professor at the Academy of International Relations at Universidad Autónoma de Puebla, Mexico. And Juan has worked inter alia at the Mexican Institute for International Cooperation and for Europe Aid Cooperation, for the Europe Aid Cooperation Office in Brussels.
Thank you very much.
Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So my topic is about the Pacific Alliance. The Pacific Alliance is a current integration process among Mexico, Peru, Chile, and Colombia that is trying to improve to foster South-South cooperation and integration among these countries. And in this sense, the educational sector is one of their most interesting activities. So, as we all agree, South-South cooperation is a result of collaboration in many sectors among developing countries with the aim to improve social and economic wealth through a specialized institutional framework. So on that basis, the Pacific Alliance, a South-South cooperation activity experience, was founded in 2011. As I said, it's an organization, an informal organization. Is an integration mechanism among Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. And it's the most recent integration and South-South cooperation process in Latin America. So the purpose of the Pacific Alliance is to improve, to foster, to enhance a deep integration process through political and economic and social linkage on where South-South cooperation is the key way in order to achieve that goals. And in this sense, the educational sector, as I already said, and I will explain later, is one of the most interesting and possibly successful activities. So the Pacific Alliance was founded in April 28, almost 5 years ago, 2011, by a presidential declaration, and its aim is to advance progressively toward the objective of achieving the free movement of goods, services, and capital and persons. It is clear that free trade is the main activity on the frame of the Pacific Alliance, with the aim to deep integration among these four countries. But as I will explain, South-South cooperation is is a very interesting tool of the Pacific Alliance. So through these last 5 years, the Pacific Alliance has gained presence in political, economic, and academic scenarios in Latin America and abroad. So in this sense, well, this is the map of the Pacific Alliance. So it's confirmed by Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile, as I said, and it has, for example, 42 observers and 3 candidates. We have as candidates Costa Rica, Guatemala, Panama, but also, for example, Canada, and even though New Zealand have applied on an informal way currently to be part of the Pacific Alliance. So, of course, the Pacific Alliance is not a huge or successful South-South cooperation activity, such as, for example, the Cuban efforts on education or in health, because of many reasons. One of them is that it's very recent, its presence and its creation. But at the end, the Pacific Alliance is trying to improve integration among these countries, working on these many items or topics where, as you can see, education is one of the most important. So in this sense, let me show you, I'm going to skip some slides. About trade, let me say something, and I'm going to speak like 30 seconds about trade because, as I said, trade is one of the most important goals of this integration process. And in this sense, even though the Pacific Alliance countries represents more than or almost 50% of total goods exports from Latin America, the trade among these 4 countries is only of 3%. So the goal is to improve this trade among these 4 countries, and this is a very difficult task to achieve. For example, this graph that I prepared for today, shows how small is the Pacific Alliance in its main topic, that is trade. I mean, the Pacific Alliance faces a very difficult path in order to improve trade among these both countries, because they are linked more with North countries, and even though, for example, with Brazil, rather than among themselves. So, well, on that basis, let me talk about finally education, and in this sense, let me show you this. Yes, the main South-South cooperation activity within the frame of the Pacific Alliance is education, and the name of the program is Student and Academic Exchange Platform. This platform is interesting because it has the aim to contribute to the professional training of human capital in affiliated countries through academic exchanges for undergraduate and graduate students, as well as university teaching in higher education institutions. So the idea is to grant 100 scholarships per year in order to improve exchange of undergraduate students, 75 and 25 PhD students, and other kind of number like 10 for teachers. So in this sense, by December 2015, more than 1,000 people have been benefited from this program. 160 universities have been participated in this program of 64 cities in 4 countries. So at the end, let me, well, this is a figure about the many kind of exchanges that we are practicing within the frame of the Pacific Alliance. So it's important to say that there's no country that is leading by itself this program. So it's a very horizontal scheme of South-South cooperation, and in this sense, the elimination of the visa requirement, the Mexican requirement of visa to Colombian and Peruvian citizens, have allowed this exchange and this academic exchange to improve the movement of students among these 4 countries. So, of course, the Pacific Alliance is mainly about South-South cooperation. In this process is more about education, and here I prepared a table with some kind of South-South cooperation projects that are being currently practiced by this union of countries. And at the end, let me say that this okay. So at the end, for finish, let me say that this academic exchange program of the Pacific Alliance is actually improving mobilization of people, of students, and it's enhancing a more deep integration among the four countries. So thank you very much, and let me say, of course, that there are more challenges than achievements in the frame of the Pacific Alliance, and in this sense, the educational sector has the aim to improve the number of scholarships are going to be granted on the next few years. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Juan Pablo. I'm extremely pleased to announce Professor Philip Nyongoro from the University of Nairobi. You speak from there? Okay. Where Philip teaches in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration. And his areas of specialization include international relations, comparative politics, and area studies.
First of all, I want to thank RIS for giving me this opportunity to interact with the colleagues. Now, when I got this invitation, I interpreted the topic to me, the role of education in regional integration, because I take South-South cooperation from the dimension of regional integration. That is, the major component of South-South cooperation is indeed regional integration. And because South-South cooperation goes beyond mere diplomatic and intra-regional exchanges, it involves, of course, institution building, which, of course, includes institutionalization of shared values, inspirations, and a shared worldview. So I want to discuss the role of education in terms of, for instance, the necessary conditions of success for South-South cooperation. And these conditions are inspired by theoretical frameworks. I know we were cautioned not to be too much obsessed with theory, but I do believe that we can gain so much from theory. So these conditions are derived from the theoretical works of Joseph Nye, those who are familiar with regional integration, the works of Karl Deutsch, the Atlantic Community, and the works of Ernest Haas. Yeah, so Ernest Haas, Etzioni, Karl Deutsch, Joseph Nye, they address the necessary conditions for regional integration. So I'll just summarize a few of these conditions, the major ones which they highlight, and then show the role of education in each of them. Now, one is called the elite complementarity. Elite complementarity. Elite complementarity, of course, this is where it is recognized that elites are very important as drivers of regional cooperation, whether you are talking of political elites or business elites. And the idea behind elite complementarity being a necessary condition for regional cooperation is that when you have elites who have shared experiences, and of course, one medium of sharing these experiences is attending the same schools, the same universities. Then you have decision making in the regional cooperation mechanisms become rather easy because the informal relationships which these elites have, because they have shared the same educational institutions and other experiences, usually reinforce the formal relations that they have, so that if there's any conflict in the decision-making mechanisms, these conflicts are very easy to overcome, and the elites will therefore reach consensus very quickly. Now, this is what gave, for instance, some regional integration scholars hope that East Africa, the experience of East Africa was such that by 1963, many regional integration scholars were arguing that there was a lot of optimism for East Africa because in the colonial era, all the three countries in East Africa had got one common university, the University of East Africa. So people like Joseph Nye, Ernest Haas, argued that this means that these political elites who had taken over the reins of power in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania were going to find it easy to work with each other to build the East African community, because they had many of them had attended University of East Africa. Then another condition is a vibrant civil society. Now, the role of civil society in regional integration cannot be overemphasized. The European Union is a very positive experience. A civil society that can inculcate a sense of civic responsibility and civic competence. Now, we all know that education through the curriculum and various components of formal education are avenues through which we can impart civic responsibility, a sense of civic responsibility and civic competence on the people. Another condition is shared norms and shared values across the boundaries. Shared norms and shared values. Education, of course, plays a very important role in inculcating shared norms and shared values. Curricula, for instance, that impart common values, like one participant here had already said how there are common institutions in Latin America where you have regional universities, for instance. Then another condition which we get for the success of regional cooperation from these scholars is a shared worldview. A shared worldview. Yeah, that is very important, that both the ordinary people and the elites who are driving regional cooperation, it is important that they share our worldview. Now, worldview in this case for South-South cooperation, it will be a southern worldview. Yeah, as southern worldview, so that we think in terms of this out and not necessarily in terms of the national entities in which we are now. Shared worldview comes in with education, because education will also harmonize our understanding of each other and promote international consciousness. Of course, this case international consciousness within this house. It also promotes most tolerance, because South-South cooperation is actually a management, it's an aspect of management of diversities, and you really need tolerance. You need that virtue of tolerance. Then, you also need another condition is that there should be what we call a regional citizen. Regional citizen, of course, as complementary to a world citizen, what we are discussing here. And I believe education plays a very important role in them. Now, what are the modalities of engagement which we have seen in South-South cooperation? Modalities of engagement which provide the trajectory for the infusion of these conditions. Intra-South organizations. That is one modality, is through intra-South organizations that may promote uniform educational practices. In the East African community, for instance, we have the Inter-University Council of East Africa, which is trying to see it to that the curriculum in the region is harmonized. We have also Interfaculty Exchanges. I do think I don't have to belabor this one very much, because the previous presenters have also talked of them. Apart from interfaculty exchanges, we have periodical seminars and conferences bringing together faculty from various universities. Then you have joint researches bringing together researchers from universities and other institutions in this. How you have conferences like the ones we have here, and maybe intra-regional periodical institutes or inter-regional periodical schools. In the East African community, we, for the last 20 years, we have been running what we call the Uongozi Institute of East Africa, which brings together students from all universities in East Africa every year. Let me just comment here. There's one comment which I wanted to make in the presentation of the World Professional Conference. Let me exploit this opportunity. Throughout our discussions here, I think we have been very unfair in one area. We have not been emphasizing the interactions between economic variables and political variables. Because for us in Africa, political will is a very, very important missing variable in the South-South cooperation. Of course, even these conditions also cannot be met without the political will. Thanks.
Thank you.
And good afternoon. You made my work simpler because I feel like a little panelist right now who's going to make my little presentation. Very difficult to speak in the session post lunch, but it's a topic which is very close to our hearts. I think most of us here are in the field of education in some way or the other. So when we looked at this whole agenda for today for the South-South cooperation, it was education and capacity building. And what is it? What are the modalities? What are the sectors? And how does one take this into South-South integration? Well, are we looking at education just as skills, as Thomas put down in his first presentation, and he divided the slide into half? Or are we going to look at education which creates citizens, people who are not just skill-oriented, who are societal-based, who have societal-based values, and cosmosins, as we heard in the last discussion? Is it just going to be peripheric literacy? I think we want to go beyond that. In terms of modality, I'll come down to a little case study that has happened in India. We've heard of Pratham, which is the NGO which has been in existence since 1990s, and it started its little assessment through Asar. Asar in Hindi means impact, and actually this was started in around 2005. By 2008, Asar, that was assessment of students' learnings at primary education, be it the reading, the writing, and the arithmetic. This whole thing was absolutely tabled and tested in a nation of a continental dimension like that of India. And then this was shared with Pakistan, it has been shared even with Mexico, and it's shared with Africa, and each country has chosen its own name. So what is great is something has been created in a very diverse environment within the country, and then has been put up for others to take it ahead, and this is the best form of capacity building, because another country can probably just conjugate it to suit its requirement and match it accordingly. So I thought this was a very good initiative, and we talked about modality and capacity building. So ASAR or ASAR as we call it, is really one of those things that I'd like to highlight upon. Going further from here, Gerardo talked about how education is equal to development. So we put this lovely equation of E equal to D, and education equal to development, and there are these outcomes that need to be measured. And here again I come back to the SR, which is at the lower or the primary education level. But we need to look at these outcomes, we need to even match it at higher levels of education. How does the education level, let's say in India, match with that in Brazil or in Argentina, if we are talking about capacity building? And what is it that we need to learn? So before learning, it is first understanding, it is first sharing, understanding, looking at the commonalities, looking at whether it can converge, and then take that forward. Only then will scholarships and exchanges work out, because if that sense of integration doesn't exist, then it won't. Unless and until somebody is absolutely interested in mythological studies or Sanskrit studies and then decides to come to India based on those various needs which are specific to them. Well, when we talk about education and technology transfers, if you have walked down this exhibition, the first stall is a very big stall of CDAC. CDAC is an absolute G2G, government to government kind of a linkage that happens, where it has trained people through the IT ministry. This is a G2G linkage where a lot of students from Africa and institutions from Africa have gained insights into this and helped in capacity building. Well, coming further, I feel one of the biggest challenges for education and capacity building is really going to look at the fourth point of the SDG, which is ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. How is the South-South cooperation framework going to be able to measure the 10 measurable outcomes that have been put in, the 10 targets that have been highlighted by the SDGs? I think this is exactly where we are looking at how education capacity building is going to take us forward into the future.
Well, of course, we talked about a lot of issues here in terms of the quality of the education and the capacity building part of it. I come from Bangladesh, and to be honest, it's a relatively very small country. However, in terms of inequality of the quality of education or access to education is a big concern for us, even for us. So I was wondering that, of course, for this kind of conferences, we get to know when we have the access to information about countries like Bangladesh, even in countries like Bangladesh or even Africa, that access to information has been a key issue. So I'm just looking for a suggestion from the panelists here that can you go for like an NGO level cooperation with the universities or the colleges so that we can ensure more grassroots level, development in terms of having that parity of quality of education, access to education. That's point one. And in that regard, can we also think about creating global platform for online education as well, to build that infrastructure for the rural areas, and also to have the institutional linkages with the quality educations, whether that is in the southern countries or even in the northern countries. And the last point that I was curious to know is, we're talking about education, but I think the component we need to focus here is also the employment part of it, because that has been a major challenge for countries like Bangladesh, when there are more people graduating from the tertiary education, but the countries are facing real problem in terms of whether public or private employment to channel that particular source of development in a proper way. So those are some of the 3 points I think I look forward to from the panelists. Thank you.
I think one last question we can take from there.
I'm Akashis Gaud. I'm an Indian Administrative Service aspirant. My question is primarily directed to the foreign delegates, and not only the panel, it's open to the room as well. Number one, there is a steady, in Indian experience, a steady decline from the primary, secondary, and higher education in terms of enrollment and then retainment. So if the panelists in the room could probably share their individual countries' experience as how they have tackled this issue of retention in your schooling and then higher education at the later level. Thank you.
I'd like to comment on the question regarding the political will. In the cases that we are looking at, this has been a critical factor, as I highlighted during the presentation. And not only from the government of Angola and, of course, the beneficiaries as well, as this is a shared commitment, but also from Brazil at different levels. The Brazilian Cooperation Agency within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, within the Confederation of Business Industries, and this is closely linked to the benefits that each of these organizations, each of these parties sees from this cooperation arrangement as well, linking to another principle of South-South cooperation, which is the mutual benefits, a win-win. One of them, which is common to the Indian case as well, is the opportunities to expand business linkages and businesses in these countries. And of course, there are more general and intangible benefits, like in Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they refer to diffuse reciprocity, which is a tendency to favor or to vote in negotiations and a favorable position towards a certain country. So creating a relationship. And this can also go to the individual level. So officials from the Confederation of Business Industries, for instance, that are working in the project, they gain international exposure and they come back with more experience and they can apply back in their works back in Brazil. So these are some thoughts that I would like to share.
Well, I will also brief comment on this issue of the political will, and then this issue of what has been done what have we done in Mexico to keep the students at school. And this thing of the political will, I mean, I think if we look at the history of the 20th century, the big, and I come back to what Thomas was saying, I mean, the big successes have happened in these places where education has been seen as a mission. And of course we know that communism failed in many instances, but it succeeded very amazingly in one, and that's basic education. If you see, for example, today, well, you have Cuba, you have Vietnam, you had even the Soviet Union at some point, educated its population quite rapidly, and the same was the case with China. And for example, in the case of Mexico, we had a literacy campaign that happened in the 20s, just after the revolution, with this kind of mystical idea that you send all these your young populations, educated population to we say in Spanish, alfabetizar, to teach the peasants to write and read. I mean, this has happened. I mean, when you have this political will, you have this missionary will, then education really goes up. I mean, the question is if we can reproduce this nowadays. And of course, I'll go back to Thomas. He has been looking at this issue more with much more detail, but I don't know if it's obvious. I mean, a country like Mexico today, can we reproduce this missionary view when we don't have a society that has this missionary vision of itself? It's difficult. But I mean, just the point is that the political will has been crucial in the 20th century to really bring literacy to developing countries. And the second point is just that what we've done in Mexico to try to keep the children at school, and it has succeeded quite well, is this cash transfer policy that has also been reproduced in many other countries. In Brazil with Bolsa Familia. In Mexico we have changed the name, as each president comes, change the names of the programs, but the idea is that you give a cash transfer to the family, basically to the woman, to the mother, and one of the conditions to give her the money each week or each month is that she has to show that she's keeping her children at school, and that has been one of the successful programs that we have had in that respect.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the comment about the migration and the link between migration and South-South cooperation. I think that, yes, in the framework of the Pacific Alliance, Mexico just removed its visa, the Mexican visa requirement to Colombian and Peruvian citizens, and since then we have increased in 35% the visitors from those countries. So that really improves and fosters a deep integration, step by step, within these countries. And in this sense, I didn't have enough time to talk about the working holiday program of the Pacific Alliance. This is a program that tries to improve the linkage between young people of 4 countries. This visa or this program allows young people from 18 to 30 years old to stay during 6 months on the other country or in any other of the 3 countries, and to stay there, and even though to work during those 6 months, in order to be allowed to continue its stay and have the opportunity to learn more about the characteristics, the culture, the way of living on that country. So I think that the Pacific Alliance is step by step trying to improve a more deep integration and in this sense the visa requirement that has been released by Mexican authorities is one of the most interesting and successful tool on the frame of this integration mechanism. Of course, it's not the clue of the integration, but it's a key part of these activities with the aim to try to foster a more deep integration among these 4 countries. So, yeah. Thanks.
Okay. I think I'll respond to the concerns raised as to whether the education we are cooperating on is producing skills which can lead to employment. Now, we want to assume that in cooperating on matters on education, the South-to-South cooperation aims at producing human resources globally competitive. And if we have to produce skills which are globally competitive, then we need to cooperate on quality or control. We should have agencies that harmonize the quality of education in our areas. That's what I really wanted.
I wanted to comment on the employability aspect. And we have known that the world has been growing at 3% plus, but employment generation has not matched that. Education, whether you look at it from the HDI point, from the MDG point, has been increasing in the South-South, but unemployment has not increased. So I don't see education really as a solution to employment. I mean, I've been in the academic world for the last 30 years, and I think it all comes with our flexibility as a human resource to what we are, these are my personal views, all right, to what we are able to adapt ourselves to. Are we, if we are supposed to be the vice president of an organization, are we willing to come down to the managerial level? Or are you willing to change trade from being a white-collared person to being, into something else? And this is where I think South-South cooperation, with the agenda that it's coming, can create a new class of social entrepreneurs, which I feel is very important, because this is a civil society organizations which will come out. Jobs are not going to increase, but human development is definitely very high on everybody's agenda. So that's where I feel that's going to be. So education becoming skill-based and that creating employment, I have my doubts in that.
I agree a lot with this, and I also should say that we cannot expect education to resolve all the problems in the world, or migration and racism, and these are issues, but I think they're too far away, and I would like to respond to your question with respect to models. I think in my work there is implicit the idea of models, but these are not, models are always very fixed and rigid and strict, and this is precisely not what they're doing. In my research on the Bolivarian Alliance, on Cuba-Venezuelan cooperation, they adjust, you just said we forgot to talk about culture and education. I highlighted that the Yo Si Puedo method, which has been awarded, gained 2 awards by UNESCO for facilitating literacy within a very short period of time, within 30 sessions, which is revolutionary in the sense of literacy acquisition. Usually programs took 1 to 2 years and people dropped out and so on. So with this method, which is an alphanumerical method, and we can that use as a model, which is then translated and adjusted to the different contexts. And equally, they use formal, non-formal education at all the different levels of the educational process, adjusting to the structure in the different countries. So they are, in higher education, similar, I would say the model is the creation of state university networks to generate synergies. That was the original idea of the University of the West Indies, where different campuses on different islands in the Caribbean specialized in a distinct area. Trinidad and Tobago was in the oil production, refinery technology and industry. Elsewhere they did health, medicine, elsewhere legal studies. And I think this is the kind of model they are further developing now with Venezuela and Central American universities. So I think there are models there. I have to end on the political again, because there's also, besides the absence of the Bolivarian projects in Latin America in this conference, there's also an absence of class struggle. And this is tremendously important if we look at South-South cooperation. My distinction between the political and the technocratic education or South-South cooperation ideas are, and we can see this in the panel here, we had Mexico, we had Brazil is in between, but the Pacific Alliance with Peru, Chile, these are all states that are not at all involved in the other project I'm talking about. And this split goes through countries, goes through governments, through the state apparatuses. If governments like the Venezuelan, like the Cuban, okay, the Cuban are more or less protected, but let's speak of Bolivia, let's speak of Ecuador, Brazil, Argentina. This form of South-South cooperation that is political and outrightly, outspokenly in favor of third world emancipation is being destabilized from within and inter and transnationally. So the situation for governments like in Brazil, we talked about that over lunch. When these governments go, this form of cooperation will go too. And I must say I had the feeling during the last 2 days in this conference that in Asia there seems to be a larger understanding or compromise between different political parties, projects, ruling elites, to look more in the common southern interest, where perhaps South-South cooperation is not so much politically contested as it is in Latin America. In Latin America, these multidimensional projects are truly dependent on who is in government. Good. I think we close here. Sorry for taking up so much time, but I truly appreciate your interest, your questions. I'm sure everyone here will be interested and very available to answer further questions. I thank you all on the panel here, and I hope we see each other again on some other occasion. Thank you.